Hey everybody, today I want to talk about a musical idea, an idea that came from music and from composers and the way that they thought about music. This idea was called Developing Variation by Arnold Schoenberg, the composer and musicologist. But it was an idea that had been around for quite a while in Western music already. It's the idea that everything grows from a relatively small, simple, and yet indeterminate set of musical content. Put in another way, a finite set of musical content can create an infinite amount of musical content through variation. Said in yet another way, sonic patterns undergo transformations, expansions, contractions, variations of every sort, ranging from change of feeling, emotion, style, to things like energy level, volume, complexity, timbre, modality. This musical idea of developing variation, therefore, acts under the impulse that repetition creates continuity and continuity creates coherence and familiarity that are necessary to a deeply engaged interest in the music. It's what gives it followability. But it also can become monotonous. Repetition and continuity means doing the same thing over and over again, which can become boring, monotonous, even annoying. Now, on the other hand, change and transformation can create interest and can create curiosity and things like this and keep engaged, but they also introduce a certain threat to followability, and again, interest will wane if followability is not provided. So this musical ideal is based on a pattern of observation among how people experience music. When certain recognizable patterns are varied, it is this sort of playful activity within these musical forms, and because we can follow it and recognize that it's all interrelated somehow, we tend to experience, rather than a multiplicity of different things, some kind of unity that appears through multiplicity. Thus, it is not merely a series of discrete variations, and on the other hand, variation itself can become a kind of thematic element whereby certain transformations take on a kind of recognizable pattern that we then associate with a coherence and a continuity. So, not all variations are developing. Many have no immediate or lasting pull on the sort of trajectory of the piece. And on the other hand, not all variations are just transformations of certain note patterns or rhythms, but this kind of thematic element can apply to variations themselves. And just as no single motive appearance within a piece, no repetition of a certain pattern was considered to be the one within Schoenberg's notion of developing variation, the musical idea itself is not expressible in any single instance of its embodiment. No single performance, no composer's use of it, taking up this idea and being inspired by it, is a kind of repetition undergoing variation itself. And it's this idea that it's still possible for new musicians to arise who find continuity and use repetition from the past, but also are able to subject it to certain variations and create a certain coherence and unity of form that is new and goes somewhere different while at the same time continuing something from the past. And in this sense, developing variation is really part of the logic of human experience, or the temporality of human experience. And this is how Schoenberg talks about it. It's a kind of logic of multiplicity. It's how pattern and order dissipate and come together to create form or to create transformation. And some content will evolve and change context, or be inverted, or find new ways of harmonizing, or be applied to a new rhythm. And this can have a developmental way of appearing through irreversibility of time. But from the perspective of the composer, this can be non-linear, right? They can go from a later part, and once they've developed a certain idea in a later part of the song, go back to the earlier part and introduce some of the elements or transitions or transformations of the motive back to the earlier part, right? From the perspective of the listener, this is a kind of introduction, right? You're introducing the part that comes later. But in the writing process, it wasn't necessarily linearly conceived in that way. So rather than a series of disconnected, vignettes of different, the same content under a different guise, or the same content with a different feel or a different landscape or whatever metaphor you like, it's not as if you have a series of variations that are disconnected. Instead, with developing variation, all of them weave together into something that is more than them, that isn't expressible simply in any of the patterns or within the changes of patterns, but within the experience that unites them and gives them coherence beyond that. Now, whether or not this idea represents some universal truth or is a purely conventional delusion, it's undeniable that Western classical music is organized by this idea that by the time of the Romantic period, this idea was fully formed, and it was a shared ideation of this essence, an essence at the heart of music that is an infinite creative power, such that we can express human life, human emotions, passions, drives, and that this is all made possible because of certain linguistic, syntactical devices within music, and I'm using that metaphorically, but with a certain kind of logic and patterning, following certain conventions and also breaking them. So the idea is traceable by certain conventions, certain musical languages, certain programmatic and ultimately cliched ways of expressing certain ideas outside of music. But this idea is not a program, it is not a plan. It as an idea, it is something that is open to novel expression and that is inventive, a kind of daring and yet skillful fulfillment of the vocation of developing variation itself. This striving to balance repetition, whether it's within a piece or a tradition, with novelty and invention. This is absolutely clear with the case of Bach, who precisely stated this idea within the art of the fugue, and we can of course look at other things like Goldberg variations, but the art of the fugue, a small amount of patterned musical content can create an immense tapestry, right, of vastly different expressive gestures and powers and styles, all of it very different, but yet all built on the same small amount of thematic content. The art of the fugue also points backward in history and forward in history, and it's also very abstract, right? Like there were no actual performance instructions. It's these notes and their relations to each other, which is open to so many different forms of expression and has led to many different ways of performing them. The idea is this inchoate germ that has certain articulations to it, has certain determinacy, but it's a not fully determined or a sort of non-determinate determinacy. Developing variation draws more out of this small, finite amount of relationality, and it stretches and compresses and does all of these things to, and inverts and mirrors and alters the rhythm, all of this in order to draw more out of that relation than is given within it. And to implicate it in a myriad of other sounds and forms and patterns, and yet to create somehow a form of unity within that complexity and variation. The musical idea is less a description or a set of rules, and rather it is a questioning of what music could be. And the effort to answer that question is ultimately always drawn from one's influences and inspirations and from all that they've heard that's come before them and among their contemporaries. And this Schoenbergian view of the musical idea as an eidetic sharing in a potentiality or a vocation, it's a conviction that music can express the human psyche and perhaps God and metaphysical truths beyond that. For Bach, the musical idea is just our closest way of comprehending the essence of God. But for Schoenberg and the Romantics, it is instead the highest and realist expression of the human psyche. In the changes and fluctuations of sensible life, we create order and pattern our movements. We habituate to a certain style of expression, and yet we are never repeating the same thing twice, and we are changing and evolving based on what we see and understand about the world later. And there's a kind of transformation unique to the duration of a single life that ebbs and flows and contrasts, and for whose past swells up certain emotions and tendencies and passions. Developing variation is a manifestation of the dynamism of the temporality of consciousness itself, the durational development, enrichment, and dissipation of our consciousness from moment to moment is the very structure that music takes within developing variation. It's a form that's not explicit in any single moment of the song playing, but is connecting in between in a kind of subtle subtending of the sounds. And I just want to end by looking at a song I recently composed on piano using some of these ideas. And in this case, I tried making use of the I Ching and some oblique strategies developed by my friend Craig at Acid Horizon. Well, okay, first I just came up with some musical content, a little chord progression, pretty amorphous as is and has a lot of different changes, but you can do a lot with that, like this little excerpt taken out of it. Nice little passionate chordal interchange. And I drew hexagram 43 from the I Ching, resoluteness, breakthrough. And the oblique strategy related to it is to use an intense, unexpected entrance after a long build-up. I then came up with this idea, very dissonant part that I didn't really like, and I tried messing with it a little bit, altering some of the harmony and stretching things out, and messing with the timing, transposing parts. But it really wasn't working out. It just wasn't what I was looking for. Now, this was meant to be the intense moment of change, and then I would write the beginning and the end of it based on this kind of middle section. But I was feeling uninspired by this and decided to start afresh with my chord progression, this time putting it into these long ascending motions. I then added some harmonic and melodic content to this. And I thought that was a pretty good expositionary part of the song. here I do some variations on these same movements. And I got to about here in the writing process when I decided to do another I Ching reading. And this time I got number 51. Arousing shock. Use unexpected loud percussive bursts. So I came up with this part. And what I first wrote was the chords, the lower chords playing heavy rhythmic patterns. And then I did another I Ching reading and got a hexagram 16, enthusiasm, composed with rapid, energetic bursts, capturing a feeling of excitement. And that was when I did the melodic line over top. And then I wrote this little transitionary lyric, and then I stopped, and I did one more I Ching reading. Hexagram 32, duration. Compose an extended, meditative piece that resists sudden change. So I took my older ascending part and I set it to the time signature 7/8, and I gave it some radical transformations from the original. And I figured out how to keep repeating this same content over and over again without ever truly repeating the same rhythmic and accentuation pattern and creating a different melody line weaving across all of these chords. So it's enduring, it's staying its course, but it's also constantly changing. And while working on this section, I did another I Ching reading and got 46, pushing upward. And the oblique strategy says, have a melody that continuously rises, never descending. Well, I felt that that was kind of already the principle behind this whole section. I did another I Ching reading and got hexagram 3, difficulty at the beginning. The blade of grass pushing up through the dirt, creating order and something predictable out of chaos, bringing structure and shape gradually into form. The beginning and the end resonating in a way never could have expected, but not without changing and not without retrospectively seeing something different than where we were when we started. A microcosm closing in on itself while opening out to the macro.